We're continuing our series in the 28 Fundamental Beliefs, and I don't know if I've made this clear to those of you who are watching on TV or those of you who are not members of our church that are in the congregation. These 28 fundamental beliefs are a statement of faith of our church. And we're doing a series on that, and if you have any more questions on how you can join our church, we'll be happy to answer those questions for you. So every Sabbath in this series that we're doing this series, we're talking about one fundamental belief after the other, and we're trying to pull out some significance, and instead of just seeing it as a statement of faith, what does that look like in our lives? And so now we're on fundamental belief number 10, and it's called the experience of salvation. I want to read that to you. It says, "In infinite love and mercy, God made Christ, who knew no sin, to be sin for us, so that in him we might be made the righteousness of God. Led by the Holy Spirit, we sense our need and acknowledge our sinfulness, repent of our transgressions, and exercise faith in Jesus as Savior and Lord, substitute and example. This saving faith comes through the divine power of the Word and is the gift of God's grace. Through Christ, we are justified, adopted as God's sons and daughters, and delivered from the lordship of sin. Through the Spirit, we are born again and sanctified. The Spirit renews our minds, writes God's law of love in our hearts, and we are given the power to live a holy life. Abiding in him, we become partakers of the divine nature and have the assurance of salvation now and in the judgment." When I was thinking about this experience of salvation, one of the things that popped into my mind that may have popped into your mind is the story of the prodigal son. Now, the story of the prodigal son, we tell it often with our lenses of Western culture, and we very much, which is very much part of this story, we apply the story to God as a loving father who goes and searches for his lost children. But if you read a little bit further into the story, you see that the story has a very, a very specific purpose and was told to a very specific group of people. And some of you may be saying, yeah, I was told to Jewish people. In the first century, Jesus was trying to explain how God, look for and save the lost. But I want to call your attention to the beginning of the chapter of Luke 15 to see that it was even more specific than that. And Luke 15, chapter 1, it sets up the scene that we're going to be seeing as we listen to this story today. Jesus is traveling to Jerusalem to the Passover feast, and from chapters 15 to 19, we see a lot of interactions that Jesus has with different people. And this interaction marks the beginning of that trip, not only to the Passover service, but we'll see in the book of Luke that Jesus is actually going to his death. And this is the first of many interactions that he has as he's traveling towards his demise, his crucifixion. And so Jesus is approached by a very regal group of Pharisees. You see this in verse 1. It says, "Then all the tax collectors and sinners drew near to him," to Jesus that is, "and the Pharisees and the scribes murmured, saying, 'This man receives sinners and eats with them.'" So whatever is going to follow, whatever Jesus' response is, he's speaking to a very specific group of people. Now, for those of you that don't know, Pharisees were a very distinguished group of Israelite people. Scholars say that they probably started around the reforms of Nehemiah and this group of people started to put a barrier around the law of God because they were coming out of the exile of Babylon, and they started to say, hey, we need to try to fix this situation so that we don't find ourselves in exile again. We need to make rules so that we don't break the rules. And they started off with a very conservative view, very strict view of God's law, and they did what they were supposed to do. The Bible talks to us about how we're supposed to set up boundaries before we even get to the point to where we could break God's law, where we could sin against God. But over the years, these laws became the laws not to break, while the laws that you shouldn't break were being the laws that were broken. If that's confusing to you, it was very much so to everyone else. It didn't make sense. Why would we keep... And Jesus had these interactions with the Pharisees on multiple occasions. He talked to them about keeping their own laws and the things that they set up to not break the other laws, but they would break the other laws, like they would give and donate all of their money, I guess, to the temple, and because it was donated to the temple, they could use it, but they could never use it to help people like their parents who were ill. Just really nonsensical laws. And so these people, not only did they have this idea of God's law, but they would look at themselves as being more righteous than other people. They would look at themselves as the chosen people of Israel, but within the chosen, they were the most chosen of the people of Israel. You see, they sat in the seat of Moses, and they followed the traditions of their fathers. You could say that the Pharisees were the best kind of church people. So you see that the prodigal son, this story that Jesus shares with the Pharisees, is a very specific lesson that Jesus is giving to the Pharisees about sin and salvation. Sin and salvation. You know, you see in different Christian circles, even today, this idea of us against them. We are the churched people. We are the chosen people of God. Those people over there, those people that are living in sin, those people that are doing what's wrong, they need to straighten up. Jonathan Edwards, who was a 19th century preacher, had some very fiery condemnations to those sinners. And it seems like in some circles of Christianity, and it could even filter into Anderson Seventh-day Adventist Church, we could have an idea about those people. They're not right. They're not in God's favor. We are righteous because we do what we're supposed to do. We get dressed up every Sabbath and we come to church to hear the preacher preach and to sing songs. And for some reason we think that that makes us more righteous than other people. The prodigal son story is for you if you find yourself among them. You see, the question that the Pharisees had for Jesus was a pointed question. You're a rabbi, you know the law of God, you're a teacher in Israel, yet you surround yourself with these people, with those people. And so you see, the Pharisees are wanting to investigate from Jesus, what is your doctrine of sin? What is your doctrine of salvation? Because at this point, all that we're seeing is that you're really lax on these people who are doing wrong. When are you going to call them out for their sins? When are you going to tell them that they're wrong? Why do you sit around and ruin your reputation with these kind of people? This is what's going on in the backdrop of the story of the prodigal son. And Jesus begins by answering with three parables. Now, it's important to note that these three parables is just the way that things were done. A lot of the times when we want to illustrate an idea, we probably just use one really good illustration. But in those times, the Hebrew way of doing this was to tell a story in threes so that you made sure that you got it. And so Jesus begins by telling the story of the lost sheep. Now, it's interesting that he would tell a story of sheep to Pharisees because Pharisees saw pastors and sheep herders as unclean. But most Pharisees would probably have sheep. They would just hire somebody out to do the dirty work. And so Jesus begins hitting them at home with this idea of a shepherd who had 100 sheep. Now, this is important to note that this was probably a community herd. And most people would own a couple of those sheep, and it was necessary for their livelihood. So when the sheep gets lost, as the story goes, the sheep gets lost, and the shepherd leaves the 99 behind, and he goes out to find the one that's lost. And if you've ever been to Israel, to the land, the Holy Land, it's not a pleasant land. There are many people who have gone off into the desert to take pictures, to be brought back on stretchers because of dehydration. So this shepherd is risking his life to go get this sheep so that the community can have what they need. And so he leaves the 99 behind, and he goes to get the sheep. He travels far and wide, gets the sheep, puts it on his shoulder, and he comes back and calls the community to celebration. Things you need to know about this to understand what Jesus is getting at. First, he's getting at that the sheep is a lost sheep. And then he's getting at the 99 are those who are in the church that stay behind. Those righteous people, those Pharisees, if you will. And number 3, you see the benevolent shepherd who goes out, this idea of God. And the Pharisees really understood. They understood what Jesus was getting at. But just to make sure that they really understood, Jesus tells another story, a story about a lost coin. A woman she loses her coin, and in desperation to find her dowry, in desperation to find their financial means. You see, most women would either keep it on a necklace, and the money would hang on the necklace, and this was for their financial well-being, for her dowry. If her husband died, she needed that money to be able to survive the rest of her life or until she got married again. Or she'd keep it in a rag, knotted up and hanging on her clothes. But at any rate, this woman loses one of her 10 coins. One of the most important things that she needs in life. And she loses this coin, and she lights up a lamp, and she sweeps her house, and she works to look for this coin diligently, and she finds the coin, and again she calls her community to celebration. And in these two stories, we don't see the actual celebration. We just see the call to the celebration. Because one, the coin that was lost was found. And the other 9 coins, or the community, these were those unchurched people, or these church people who had lost this lost person, this dead person. And now the community is invited to rejoice, and this woman is a picture of God. Really weird for a first century man to use a woman to reflect God. But then he gets to the third story, and this is where it gets really good for the Pharisees, because they start to understand where Jesus is going. He tells a story of a father who has 2 sons, and if you're a good Pharisee, you know what Jesus is talking about. You see, in the first century, there were a couple of people that would take different Bible stories, and they would use the elements of those Bible stories to convey a story that would be fitting for that day. And Jesus seems to take the story of Jacob and his brother Esau And he turns it around, like the rabbis say that the Bible is a jewel. You just turn it to see every angle. He turns it around a little bit to express something that the Pharisees needed to hear. Remember, how do you hang out with these guys? How do you mess around with these unfaithful sinners? These reprobates? How do you lose your reputation? And Jesus begins by saying in verse 11, a certain man had 2 sons. And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falls to me. So he divided them his livelihood. Notice that the son comes to the father. And there's these ideas of Jacob going to Isaac and these ideas of Jacob tricking Isaac. But Jesus turns it around a little bit and he begins to say that the son didn't do any trickery. He just came to his father and he said, Dad, I want you to give me my portion of what you have and give it to me so that I can be gone with this. And in essence, every Pharisee wanting to know what Jesus' idea of sin and salvation is, they were on track with Jesus, because when you went to your father to ask for the inheritance before your father's dead, you might as well just have gone to him and said, Dad, hurry up and die. I want my money. This was unspeakable. You could hear the gasps from the Pharisees and the whispering. And this guy's bad. Not only is he a ruiner of his reputation, but he ruins the reputation of his father, his community. He's reprobate. This guy is a sinner. Jesus is painting the worst possible picture of a sinner that he can, according to the people that he is talking to. And even in our day, it would be unthinkable for someone to go to their parents and say, Dad, I wish you would die already so that I can have my part. Nevertheless, the father, he gives and divides his livelihood among the 2 sons. Now, the Pharisees listening to this story, they knew that they were the son that stayed. They were the good child. Because remember, Jesus is looking at the people that stay, the church, the lost, and the grace of God. And they knew very well that they were the good child that stayed behind. But Jesus is planting something there, because instead of the good child saying, no, Dad, how could I dishonor you by taking my portion? You keep what is left and I will continue to work for you. No, the good son takes his part too. He just doesn't leave and squander it. So now Jesus is laying this seed that there are 2 sinners. One that squanders his father's goods and wishes his father was dead, and the other one that accepts the fact that his brother would do such a thing and takes his portion also, saying underhandedly, I kind of wish you were dead too. How many of us find ourselves in the very same situation? Churched or not? Find ourselves in the very same situation where we look at God and say, I wish you were dead. I mean, we don't say it to his face like that. We're the good guys in the story. We're not the prodigal son. We just think it in our minds. We accept kind of life how it goes. We still come to worship, but our lives and our hearts and our daily walk don't portray that we love our Father. I mean, Adam and Eve, they're in the garden, and God says, don't eat of the fruit. Your power to rule this world is with me. But you get to choose. And the choice that they made was to say, we don't need you to rule. We can do it on our own. Now, when you tell the king, we don't need you, we can rule on our own, what are you saying to the king? I wish you were dead, so that I could take your place. And that is the story of sin. The story of sin is us saying, God, we want to take your place. We know better for our lives. We know better what to do in every situation of our lives. Let us take the wheel. And we're like the two sons. And remember, Jesus is using the story of Isaac and Jacob, not quite in the way that we think faithfully necessarily, but he's using this idea that Jacob deceives his dad and he goes off and he takes, whatever he had, whatever his mother gave him to run away from Esau's wrath, he takes and goes off into a distant land. Many of these elements are in the story of Isaac, Jacob, and Esau, the father and the two sons. One of the sons tricks his dad and goes off into another land. The other son says, wait till he gets back and I get my hands on him. He's going to be a goner. And the story continues, and these Pharisees are waiting intently because they're wanting to know what Jesus thinks about sin and sinners, what Jesus thinks about salvation, why Jesus is messing around with these no good sinners instead of being in the presence of the righteous Pharisees, the chosen of God, the stock of Israel. So Jesus continues to tell the story. And in verse 13, he says, and not many days after, the younger son gathered all together, journeying to a far country, just like Jacob did. And there wasted his possessions with the prodigal living. And he turns it around. He doesn't actually say that Jacob squandered his living, but he's using this story of the father and the son to illustrate to the Pharisees that this is your answer. And even though Jacob didn't squander the things that he had in a far city, he actually became prosperous. We see that this rendition, for the sake of proving a point, Jesus says that this guy did away with everything his father had worked for. I mean, he is trying to establish this guy is a no good sinner. Not only did he wish for his father's death, not only did he disgrace his father and his family's reputation, not only did he not do honor your father and your mother, breaking God's law, he goes off into this Gentile land and he squanders it with prostitutes, as we'll see later on in the story. He spends it in debauchery and sin. Jesus is painting a picture for the Pharisees. And the Pharisees are tracking with him. They're saying, yeah, that's a sinful guy. But little by little, he's pulling the Pharisees in. Now, we don't know what the good brother does. We just know that the good brother stays and he shows an appearance of faithful. But remember, the good brother took his part too. He just did it quietly. It wasn't out in the open. A lot of times we forget that we're just like those people out there. Just do it quietly. We've mastered the art of deception to where we can make sure that no one in the church knows my sin. But you stayed. I guess there's an idea, a reason to be better than those people. You know, the story says, as Jesus continues, that not only does he go off into a far country, but when he had spent, verse 14, when he had spent all, there arose a severe famine in the land, and he began to be in want. This guy gets what he deserves. He walked off with his father's stuff. He's an open sinner. He disgraced his dad. He's hanging out with the Gentiles. And now he gets to the point to where he's losing everything just as he should. Remember, the Old Testament concept of sin is that when you sin, you get the bad. And when you do good and serve God, you get the good. And God has a sense of humor. I don't know if it's a sense of humor, but God kind of helps us understand that that's not always the case, because the Old Testament story of Job says when you're the good guy, sometimes you get the bad. But he's talking to the Pharisees, these dogmatic religious people who are the faithful son. They're doing what they're supposed to do. And he wants them to think that the real bad guy here is the prodigal. He goes even a step further to show how bad of a sinner this guy is, and he says in verse 15, then he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country. He became, he started to work for a Gentile, a no-no for Jews or upstanding Jews. And he sent him into the field to feed swine. No self-respecting Jew would ever do that. And he got to the point to where in verse 16 it says that he was starving, and he would gladly have filled his stomach with the pods that the swine ate, because no one gave him anything to eat. He is at the bottom of the barrel of sin and its consequences. He's destitute. Have you ever said to anybody, and I get this a lot as a pastor, Pastor, I'm too bad to be saved? Jesus is painting a picture of the worst kind of person. A disloyal, foolish sinner. But then he came to himself in verse 17. He came to himself and he said, how many of my father's hired servants have bread enough to spare, and I perish with hunger? When I arise and go to my father, I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. And he arose and came to his father. This is the point where the Pharisees realize that Jesus is getting around to this story of Jacob and Esau and his father. And now the son is coming back. The bad son is coming back. And we know that as the Pharisees, they were thinking, yes, now it's his time to be cast out in front of the rest of the community. As soon as he gets back, his father is going to perform a ritual called kazah. And this ritual was to throw a hot pot of beans, very somehow significant in that culture, at the feet of the son, and in front of the whole community, curse him as dead. I mean, this guy takes everything from his father and runs off into sin. He's dead to him anyway. Any self-respecting Jewish father would have written this son off and called him dead. We see this when we talk about sin and salvation. This is the question of the Pharisees: sin and salvation. Where do you stand on it, Jesus? What is your idea of this? And Paul, being a Pharisee, a former Pharisee himself, uses this illustration and when he's talking and writing in his letters, like in phrases when he said, we were dead in the trespasses of sin, but now we're made alive in Christ Jesus. Because, face it, folks, when we walk away from the author of life, when we choose to rule on our own behalf, when we wish God to be dead, not just in our words, but also our actions, and even us in the church when we sin willingly and knowing, but we've been so good at hiding it that we are still the good sons. We're still the Pharisees. We're still the good people, the church folk. We are dead in the trespasses of our sin. were lost. Lost. I will arise and go to my father. I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me a hired servant. And verse 20 says, Then he arose and he came to his father. Jacob comes back to the land, fearing that his brother Esau is going to do away with him. And I'm sure fearing this man that his father will not receive him back. He goes to strike a bargain with dad just to be a servant because he knows, because of his actions, that he doesn't deserve to be a son again. And so he arose and came to his father. But when he was still a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. Instead of performing and waiting for his son to get there and performing kazah on his son and cursing him in front of the community as a destitute and no longer his son, his father runs out to spare him the embarrassment. Nowhere do you see a Jewish man of means hiking up his robe and running out to an unworthy, sinful, ungrateful son. It's as if Isaac runs to his son Jacob to receive him back. He receives him and he says in verse 21, And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and your sight, and I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. And as he's about to go to the next thing that he had rehearsed, the father says to the servant, he cuts him off, and he says to the servant, Go and kill the fatted calf, and let us eat and be merry. And this is the point of the story here. Get ready for it. It's repeated twice. For this, my son was dead, and now he's alive again. And he was lost and is found. And they began to be merry. Now the celebration actually happens. The father receives his son again, and he passes him from death to life and from lost to found. That's the experience of salvation that Jesus gives even the most destitute of us. Now the Pharisees are kind of squirming because this is against everything that they've ever taught. It's against all of the things that they thought were right. And the boy that stayed behind and he quietly took his inheritance, wishing in his heart and by his actions for his father's death. Now he lets it all come out. Esau is angry now. And he answered, and he spoke up, and he was angry in verse 28, and that he would not go in. He wouldn't even go into the party. Therefore, his father came out and pleaded with him. Still, God pleads with the church that says, no, I'm never going to be a part of that. It's almost like when we become Christians, we get so far removed away from our public displays of sin that we think we have it together and would never sit down with those outsiders. Now we get to see the face value, the acting out of the good son that stayed, the righteous son that stayed. We get to see him acting it out, what was really in his heart. And he's angry with his dad, and he wouldn't go into the celebration, and therefore his father came out and pleaded with him. So he answered and he said to his father, Lo, these many years I've been serving you, and I've never transgressed your commandments. That's Pharisee language. He's talking to the Pharisees. I kept everything that I was supposed to keep, and look, You never gave me a goat that I might make merry with my friends. You see, what was in his heart was what the prodigal acted out. He wanted to do the same thing that his brother did, but he didn't have the guts to do it. Lost just as much as his brother, but still in the church. But soon as this son of yours, verse 30, came, who has devoured your livelihood with harlots, you killed the fatted calf for him. And then he said, Son, you are always with me, and all that I have is yours. It was right that we should make merry and glad, for your brother was dead and now is alive. There's the other time that Jesus gives the point of the story. Your brother was dead and now is alive, and was lost and now is found. And the story drops off. There's no ending. We don't know what the prodigal says or does. We don't know what the brother, what conclusion he comes to. Jesus does this on purpose because now it's in the court of the Pharisees. You see, those who look to be righteous really aren't. Those who tout about with their them versus us are not the righteous ones. They're just the ones that are doing it underneath the surface. Another thing that Jesus was trying to show is that you call yourself Israel. You call yourself Jacob. But here in this story, Jacob is the worst of the sinners. And Esau is the one who stayed. And you could never, ever be called. Esau became a father of a Gentile nation. And now Jesus flips the tables. And he shows that the Pharisees, for not wanting to be Jacob, not wanting to be the prodigal that was forgiven, knowing their past and their exile in Babylon, they still say, we don't want to be those people. They end up putting themselves in the position of Gentiles. A catch-22 for the Pharisees. So the story ends, it stops abruptly, it never ends. Jesus doesn't end the story. And the Pharisees who had the question, how do you see sin and salvation, Jesus? Why are you hanging around these people? Why do you associate yourself with these sinners? Now they're left with a picture of a gracious Father who forgives and calls the sinner home. And they have to answer the question, am I like the Father? God forbid, some of them would say, because the Father's too lenient. Am I like the prodigal? No way. He's too much of a sinner. Am I like the son who stayed? No way. Because he still dishonored his father by taking the inheritance and then dishonored his father by calling out his decision. So who am I? I think the call to this story is to have the character of the Father. That which was dead is alive. That which was lost is now found. And when we have that attitude of our brothers and sisters who slip up and offend us, of the people on the outside that don't seem to be Christian enough, we are doing the Father's work. And the call is to rejoice, to celebrate, because that which is dead is alive, and that which was lost is now found. And if we're real with ourselves, if we're really honest with ourselves, we know that we've been the prodigal and we've been the son who stayed, both lost and in need of the reviving power of God's salvation.